Perfect. So I have some slides, and what I was thinking, I use these slides to build a discussion, and hopefully what I will present today is of relevance. And please, I encourage everyone to ask questions and or interrupt me wherever you see fit, so we make this more of a dialogue than just a monologue. So from my perspective, I will put the presentation on the screen. And I will, hopefully this is visible to everyone.
Yeah, we can see that. Thank you.
Perfect. So thanks again, Mauricio, for arranging this. I'm happy to be on a call, and it almost feels like being in Dublin. So so it's as close to traveling as I get these days, but I guess I'm not the only one here. But we are busy. The markets are active. We have 10 listings this week, which is just a fantastic momentum. Most of these listings are on our growth market platform, which is Nasdaq First North. And last year we ended up with a fantastic year, all considering. And what I would like to do is to make sure that I try to give you an insight in terms of how the market, the market activity that we're seeing, why we feel that the market is relevant for non-Nordic companies, and explain a bit how to access the market and what are the key characteristics of the market. So those are some of the topics that I would like to touch upon today in the presentation. And again, I don't want to get lost in slides, but rather focus on a dialogue. So wherever you see fit in interrupting or asking questions, please either post them, and Moilisha, please help me guide, any questions you think I'm not addressing. Okay. So I think Europe certainly looks different after Brexit, but we are, comfortably today, I would say, the leading SME market in Europe. And how do we describe this? Well, essentially, if you look back the last 5 years, the listing momentum has been quite outstanding in terms of the overall activity. And I think what is important here is that, I take great pride in the fact that we are listing so many companies and not only on the capital raise, because I think what is a key here is that our platform has really been made accessibility possible to the public markets for smaller, medium-sized growth companies in various sectors. And I think, the typical tendencies when you compare IPO markets, the focus is always capital raise. Yeah, that's easy, because all you need is, one Airbnb, and then you've covered everything, or one Deliveroo, or whatever it is. But the key asset here is, how do you create a liquid market, active market for small and medium-sized companies to access the public markets and the benefits of the public markets? So what I like to focus on is not only the capital raise as a part of the IPOs, but also the continuous activity that we see in the secondary market, how accessible and active the secondary market is in terms of issuing new shares, but also in the secondary aspect. And I think that's equally important as the IPO market. So last year, 80 new listings, we include everything there. In that, we also have 10 companies that transition from our growth market to the main market. Very important, because I like this to be a journey for a company to access our growth market and then basically be able to grow. And that growth can either be grow into our main market, potentially do a listing in another market. The US could be an option. So there are different vehicles, but where we want our platform to be is to really to support that growth journey for the company. Then you have IPOs, but you also have a number of listings where they have not raised capital as in a traditional sense, but more done a private placement and then a listing. So you have a number of various levels of activity across the line in order for the company to choose which route is the best for them in terms of accessing the public markets. Now, if you look at since 2014, 1/3 of all European IPOs have been in the Nordic markets, and where Sweden is outstanding in terms of the activity level year on year. And so if you look to 2020, 44% of all IPOs were in the Nordic markets. It just goes to show, at the end of the day, this is truly an equity market, which is to support companies across all sectors. So we have a number of companies that are accessing the markets, and it's not really depending on one specific sector, it's really across all sectors. And I think that's important because that's typically a question, what are the companies, what are the investors looking for, from a non-Nordic company? Well, it's really ultimately the reason why they want to access the public markets. It's not necessarily a sector-driven aspect. Then, of course, we see more interest from certain sectors, but it's not specific to a certain sector. Okay. Now, there are other aspects why the Swedish market is so active. And again, we own and operate 7 Nordic markets, but we are in this context focusing on the Swedish market in terms of our non-Nordic offering, because we feel this is the deepest and most active market in the Nordics today. And therefore, we feel this is the most compelling argument or compelling platform to absorb or to take on an international listing. If you by any chance happen to have a lot of business in Copenhagen or Finland, then we could of course explore that marketplace as well. But we feel that the Stockholm market is the most active market and the best market to access. So from a trading perspective and from an activity perspective, the Swedish market is also very active. So I think what is key here is not only focusing on the IPO and the capital raise, but also the liquidity and the activity from a trading perspective. This is where Sweden also continues to be, the strongest representative in terms of activity around SMEs. Now, what is it that makes the Swedish market so attractive is that fundamentally you access investors. And what kind of investors do you access? Well, fundamentally you access international investors. That's the top layer that you are able to work with over time. And this is in a list of the 25 most active international investors in Sweden. And I can send you all these, so you will have these slides afterwards. But again, giving you a feeling that this is not necessarily just a local market. It is a possibility for you to target non-Nordic investors or international investors over time, either as a part of the IPO or as a part of your growth journey as a listed company. Now, when you go into the Nasdaq First North market, what is this? This is basically a growth market segment that we have within our control. And basically we have this structure in Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. It's the same rule book. But fundamentally behind each rule book or each marketplace, we have a different equity market. And the Swedish market continues, again, I repeat this, but it really is fundamentally the most active market that we are seeing in Europe today. And what is important here is to understand that this market has grown substantially. And with the number of companies, you also grow the ecosystem. You grow the ecosystem in terms of advisors, financial and legal, but also in terms of analyst coverage, in terms of research coverage, and the overall trading community is expanding, not only nationally, but also internationally. So the access to these companies is really truly developing, and the ecosystem in itself is becoming much more dynamic than we had several years ago. So today you have 400 plus companies listed on Nasdaq First North. 90% of these are listed in Sweden. On our markets, you have 25 international companies. Again, these are companies that are, and we will touch upon this, but we also have a number of international companies that use a legal structure where they put a Swedish topco on top. And we can talk about that as a part of the reference. So there's substantially more international companies listed on our markets today than the 25 I represented here. The overall market value, and of course this is fluctuating, but roughly 50 billion euros on Nasdaq First North. Last year, as I mentioned, as a part of the 80 listings that we had roughly 40 IPOs. The largest IPO last year was a foreign company. It was a Swiss medtech company that raised 150 million euros. And the largest secondary that was done on Nasdaq First North last year was 650 million euros by a gaming company called Embracer. And total capital raised in 2020, including IPOs and secondaries on Nasdaq First North, was 3 billion euros. Now, another way to reflect the development of First North, and again, this is all towards the end of 2020, but the development has continued to be positive, is the index measurement. So the First North 25 is a cross-Nordic First North index. It is actually a tradable index now. There is an instrument that trades this First North 25. But ultimately, it reflects the development of the growth, reflects the overall development of the growth companies listed on First North. So it is substantially outperformed our main market index. And also we've used as a comparison the AIM 100 index in terms of its overall development. Now, one of the key topics that I come back to on an ongoing basis is not the only aspect here that a lot of companies focus on is what is my ability to raise capital on the day of the IPO. Very important. However, equally important is the ability to raise capital over time as a listed company. So what I've reflected here is in the blue is the capital raised as a part of the IPO last year and the years before. But then equally important, as I mentioned before, is the secondary capital that you're able to raise on First North. And so the market really is an active market, and the investors like the opportunity to invest in companies that are looking to raise more capital over time to support their equity story. Now, I just wanted to use one example of a sector which is developing very rapidly, and that's the clean tech sector. Now, we have a number of these different sector slides. I haven't focused on them too much in this presentation, but I can send them as a follow-up also to Marlicia to share with you. But clean tech is clearly one of those sectors which has developed rapidly for two reasons. One is a lot of the innovation within clean tech, as you know, is within small or medium-sized companies. And they need access to capital over a longer period of time. The VC culture within this sector is relatively weak, and the ability, the need to come back to market to raise capital to support that growth story for this sector is more important than many other sectors. And I think in a way it's comparable to the biotech sector, where you basically have different phases of development, and for each phase, typically companies come back to raise capital. Biotech and life science is probably the most active sector on our markets today. So within the clean tech, we have 40 plus companies on First North. And again, I'm focusing a lot on Nasdaq First North. Of course, our main market is also accessible, but I like the idea of companies accessing the public markets through Nasdaq First North to get to know the public markets, to mature, to get everything in place. And as they grow, they can evaluate the opportunity to move them to transition into the main market, as roughly 100 companies have done since we launched Nasdaq First North. So we have 40 plus companies within the clean tech sector. This spreads across 7 different sectors within, technology, or whether it's paper, pulp and paper, etc. So clean tech is across, it's a horizontal sector rather than a vertical. Average capital raise within the sector is 7.5 million euros. I think the largest capital raise as a part of a secondary last year on First North for a clean tech company was roughly 50 million euros. The average share price development since listing is roughly 100%. Again, clean tech has suffered a bit most recently, but overall it remains a very active market. Average market cap is 157 million euros. Again, it shows to you that you don't need to be a large company to list on Nasdaq First North to access that market. And the total market value, again, is 7 billion euros. And this is a list of number of companies that have leveraged the market and access the market from a listings point of view on Nasdaq First North. And again, here shows the amount of capital raised and how active the secondary market is for this particular sector. I don't have the 2020 numbers, but these are the years from 2019 to 2016. Now, I've been talking about Nasdaq First North. So how does it fit into our overall context? Nasdaq First North growth market. Growth market is a growth market status that we have. It's an EU status. It allows for certain, it's an umbrella for basically allowing for certain requirements, benefits for companies listed on Nasdaq First on a growth market. Nasdaq First North is such a market. So, for example, there are some prospectus facilitations. There's some easiness that have been made to support how to handle MAR, the Market Abuse Directive. So there are a number of advantages of being listed on a growth market. Within that Nasdaq First North, we also have a premier segment. The premier segment differentiates itself by adding a certain number of requirements. Those requirements are such as IFRS, market cap size 10 million euros, that's not particularly high, free float 25% compared to on First North, which is 10%. And I'll walk you through the requirements as the next step. And then you have the main market. And the main market is basically where, you know, roughly 100 companies have transitioned from First North since we launched it in 2006. And main market ultimately gives you more access to investors and a broader palette of investors overall, both internationally and nationally. And you also get much more index exposure within the main market than you have on Nasdaq First North. Now, how long does a listing take? Well, it all depends, of course, on how well the company is prepared. But overall, we have seen companies do this in 4 months, 4 to 5 months. But I would say, all in all, it's a 12-month process for the company to be ready and to be able to take on, you know, the market. And I count in the dialogue with advisors, the dialogue with investors, etc. But once you press the start button, it could be a very smooth process, and we've seen companies do this within 2 to 4 months. And so it is a very well understood process. It's very lean, both in terms of requirements, but also in terms of the engagement with us as an exchange, but also with the advisors around us. One aspect that you have to keep in mind here is that you need to have a certified advisor, and that certified advisor can, you know, in some cases is also the financial advisors, but essentially what the certified advisor does is 2 things. One, make sure that you prepare and you hand in, they are the ones responsible for handing in your application to the exchange. And then they're also responsible for you as on an ongoing basis as a listed company, very similar to the Nomad process, where basically they are there to coach you and advise you on managing the public market. And there's a whole range of different certified advisors, so you ultimately can choose the one that suits you best. Now, here are the requirements on a high level between First North and First North Growth Market, First North Premier, and then main market. So you see on a overall, on a high level, where we see basically, you know, these are the high level rules. And from a working capital point of view, you need 12 months of working capital. That can also be combined with you raising capital as a part of the IPO or the listing. But overall, you have a differentiation between free float between the markets. You have a differentiation between market cap on First North Premier, financial reporting IFRS on First North Premier versus local accounting standard on First North. You have to apply to, you have to adhere to the MAR rules. These are European EU standards. And you, on the Premier segment, there is a requirement that you adhere to a governance code, and that is either your local one, the Irish one, or the Swedish one. But if you choose to apply to the Irish one, that's possible, but you would then need to just explain on a high level the differences, and your legal advisors can help you with that. And the certified advisor is again a requirement on both First North and the Premier, First North Growth Market, and also the Premier Growth Market. And again, the role of the certified advisor is really there to help you prepare for the IPO, but also as a listed company. Now, one thing that we feel is key here is that we, through our Nasdaq franchise in the Nordics, want to help you position yourself towards the US. Many of my discussions outside the Nordics is related to helping European companies access the US markets. Since, since the last 5 years, 83% of European companies have access to US markets through Nasdaq. And we see a trend of more and more dual listings. So companies that have grown in the local markets, taking a natural next step to dual list in the US. A lot of these are healthcare companies. A lot of these are tech companies, but we see more and more sectors looking at the US markets. And of course, recently now with the SPAC structure, we are seeing companies also accessing the US through the SPAC market. And what we do with companies from a listing perspective, if you list with us, we then help you with events, partnerships in the US, tower visibilities, making sure we create a plan together with you to increase your visibility in the US. And of course, we have different mechanisms. So this is just giving you a flavor of some of the tools that we have to help you position yourself in the US, besides giving you the Nasdaq brand to support your further growth and transparency and visibility. So really, that was the presentation I had in mind. I wanted to, just use this as a basis for discussion rather than end this presentation. If there are other questions, maybe I have other slides that also could support those questions as well. Well, Alicia, is there anything that you think that I have missed or I should focus on here?
Well, we'll open it up now just so for the attendees, there's a Q&A functionality there. So if they want to ask questions, they just need to either raise their hand and they can speak, or just type the questions to me here and I'll relate them to you, Adam. But thank you very much. I mean, it's I suppose, compared to the equity market that we have here in Dublin, there's a huge difference. Last year, I think there was 2 listings in total in Dublin. So that ecosystem you've been talking about, we just don't have it here anymore. It's also, it's ossified over the years. And so I do think that's one of the standouts for me about Stockholm is all the support around IPO and listing companies over there. First question in here is any information on share performance post IPO ? Adam, I don't know whether you have that kind of information or you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very relevant question. I think from our perspective, if you look at the index, that's, the best representative in terms of the overall development of the market. Each company has to be looked at separately, but overall, typically when you do an IPO here in the Nordics, depending on who, the size of the raise, who you target as investors, you typically, the typical format of the IPO is that you try to lock in a certain number of corner investors. And those cornerstone investors can either be institutions, high net worth individuals, but there's a whole range of different investors that you try to lock up in the context of the IPO. Then there's another aspect, which is, how do you involve retail? Typically, retail gets involved in the next step as a listed company. So you see a lot of activity in the post-IPO market from a trading perspective. I showed you some of the numbers that, the clean tech performed, it was 100% up. You have different aspects, within different sectors. At the end of the day, we don't guarantee a share price development by any means, but what we do guarantee is an active liquid market. And from our perspective, this is really ultimately a journey where you're able to access the public markets to support you from a capital raising perspective, creating liquidity, etc. So I can share with you, I can put together some numbers which Maja-Lisa can then send to you as a follow-up. But overall, what you will see is that this is not only a capital raising activity, market, it's really an active liquid market. And if you as a company meet the expectations, you will be met with a very active market, both from a research point of view, from a trading point of view, and from an investor point of view.
Thanks, Adam. So another question in here: how different are the rules for the Premier section, and does being Premier mean an easier listing?
Well, the reason why we segmented it and created the Premier segment was to differentiate a bit for two reasons. Where we felt that certain companies, as the Nasdaq First North market developed, were now, essentially when we launched Nasdaq First North, it was, essentially only a growth market. And by that, I mean, we were trying to really make the public markets a lot more accessible, which we succeeded. But what we also succeeded in doing was that now companies are choosing the Nasdaq First North market as a clear stepping stone to move to the main market over time. And by doing so, they're able to attract institutional investors. They're able to work with advisors that typically would have done listings on the main market. And for each success story that we've been able to deliver, this market has now established itself much more. So from our perspective, the Premier segment was really an opportunity to create a segment where the company could send a signal to the investors that this is not only a great commercial investment, but also it's a well-run investment. And by adding layers such as IFRS, governance code, it kind of sends a signal to investors that, not only is this company well-run from a commercial point of view, but also from a governance point of view. We have fantastic companies on First North. We see an increased interest from First North Premier. If you do have IFRS, then I would definitely recommend you to evaluate doing a Premier listing. It's more a signal to the market rather than anything else. But we see some very successful First North listings, so it's really case by case. But the listing per se, it's the same rules, pretty much. Some of the requirements are a bit higher due to IFRS and so on, but the procedure is the same. The dialogue with investors potentially is a bit easier if you choose the Premier segment.
Okay, so I guess that was one of the, in terms of the question, do you get a better IPO if you're going into the Premier, or is it?
Well, it's not. You can't guarantee results, but essentially you're sending one additional signal to the market, and so that they feel more comfortable in terms of the numbers they're looking at, how the companies run from a governance point of view.
I suppose my understanding as well, Adam, is that very often companies on the Premier, it's that step up, but they're signaling to the market that they're preparing to step up to the main market, right?
Correct. So you have a number of companies a year that go from First North to Premier once they've established IFRS, and they're kind of sending a signal that they're maturing. And we would like, not all companies from First North go via Premier to the main market, but most companies that go to the main market from First North go from the Premier segment.
Okay.
So clearly, it's building on that stepping stone mechanism. And again, it's nothing that we force companies to do. It's more, something that the company decides now is the right time for them to take the next step.
Yeah, I suppose most Irish companies, I think it's fair to say any Irish company going to Sweden to IPO will already be doing IFRS. And just on that, another question that's come in is to talk a little bit about the transition from First North to Premier. Is it usually another fundraising event, or is it a technical exercise?
No. So it's more a legal exercise, and it's more actually the step from First North to First North Premier is very easy. It's basically a dialogue with us. Typically, companies do not combine that with a financial event. We have started to see signs that companies try to combine it with liquidity events because they're sending a signal, but it doesn't have to be. And I would argue that the majority of these transitions are something they communicate earlier on, and then deliver on. And it's not a complicated step to take First North to First North Premier. Moving from First North Premier to main market is a bit more demanding because the rules set for the main market are a bit higher, but it's also a very well understood process.
Yeah. I suppose another trend we're seeing with IPOs is the use of SPACs and other ways to list your company without having to do IPO. Are we seeing any of this in Sweden yet?
Well, I think before touching upon SPACs, I would also argue that one thing I didn't touch upon in my presentation is that, one of the benefits of being a listed company with us is that we also have a very active bond market. So you could, once as a listed equity, you also have an easier time raising a bond if you want to diversify your investment or sort of fundraising capabilities. So we do have a First North bond market. It's very well used by a lot of non-Nordic companies as well. Could potentially also be a first step for some of the companies to start with the bond market. But we do see that some listed companies with us do use the bond market quite actively. In terms of SPACs, well, it's a topic of the year and or the last few years here, last 2 years on a global level. We just launched the SPAC rulebook for the Nordic markets. We are seeing our first SPAC will be listed end of March, 25th of March. And it's raising 400 million euros. And they will target a growth company in the Nordics. I think that's their main target. And we're seeing a second SPAC coming now. We'll probably have 10 to 15 SPACs by the end of the year in the Nordic markets. I think it's maybe a bit too early for a company to assume they will access the market through SPACs in the Nordics today. But we are seeing more international interest to list SPACs in Stockholm. So that is one possibility that we are engaging with. But over time, as the SPAC community builds up, then that could be a vehicle or a possibility for a company to approach the market through a SPAC.
And is that main market or is that also First North?
We decided to put the SPAC itself on the main market, but when you do the business combination through the SPAC, you can choose to list either on First North or on the main market. So basically the SPAC is just listed on the main market. Once you do the business combination, you can then approach us and you basically say that, well, listen, we've identified a company that is more suited for First North, and then we would review you and list you on First North.
Okay, and the 400 million, is that SEK, 400 million SEK or 400 million euro that SPAC is raising?
So the SPAC, the first SPAC that's launching now is 400 million euros. And the second SPAC will probably be around 200 million euros.
And is that money being raised in the market?
Yeah, so these are the typical investors that we have, the Nordic investors, pension fund investors. So they've secured 40% of Cornerstone investors already. And these are mainly Nordic investors right now, and they're doing the roadshow. And I think, they're aiming to close the books any week now. So they're listing on the 25th, so they're listing this week.
Yeah, that's Thursday. That's
yeah, Thursday. So time flies here.
And but the people behind that are presumably they're well-known investors. They already have a track record today of,
Yeah, I mean, what is important to understand here is that one of the key strengths of our market is that if a small, medium-sized company can talk to a large pension fund, because the large pension funds will put up tickets of $2 to $3 million. The challenge that most of Europe has today is that large pension funds will not put up tickets less than. And that means that, you don't have an active institutional market for smaller SMEs. And that's what we have in the Nordics. So, but they are also, of course, eager to put in more capital for each specific opportunity. So at the end of the day, you see a very active IPO market, active institutional market. For this particular SPAC, we saw a lot of institutional interest.
And is there any indication they already have a target company in mind, or is that to be?
Well, that's for them to reveal, but it's not something that they. The structure of SPACs is that you can't come to market with a specific target in mind.
Right.
You can define, what kind of company you're targeting, but you can't list a SPAC and say, listen, this SPAC is for this company.
Right. And have you seen many companies do reverse into listed companies?
Good question. So we, with 400 companies on Nasdaq First North, of course, there is a small tail of companies that are not performing as we had hoped, or changing their business model and so on. So we have a number of companies that have, we see a number of companies accessing the markets through reverse takeovers or backdoor listings. Having said that, since the IPO market is so well understood and it's so lean and efficient in terms of process, most companies exploring the public markets are actually choosing the IPO route or the direct listing route. But the option is there to identify, and many advisors have a clear view on the pros and cons of accessing the market through either a direct listing or a backdoor listing or an IPO.
Yeah. So another question on about the bond market: is there a minimum regulatory or rule of thumb as to how much to raise, and what is the timeline and fee structure generally?
For the bond market?
Yes.
I should have that on the top of my mind. But we could actually do quite small bonds on the First North bond market. I would need to send you, I'm an equity guy, so I just talk about how great the bond market is, but then I forget all the details. So let me get back to you on that. And we'll make sure to answer those questions very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, my own experience, Adam, I'll share it here.
Yeah, please do. You probably know more than me.
Yeah, well, I've talked to a few of the brokers, and they seem to indicate that about 25 million euro is kind of the minimum, and they'll go up to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think that's more a commercial requirement.
Yeah, I think below that.
In order to get advisors engaged, so it's not a requirement from our perspective. It's more a commercial requirement in terms of how to access get the interest of the advisors.
Yeah, I think it's you can still do bonds at lower amounts, but they tend to be just single purchase, a single investor bond. Like 10 million might only be just one investor rather than and the other thing is they can be done in about 8 weeks. It's not, you don't need a prospectus, and the fee structure is typically about 5% of the funds raised. So that's my own. But if anybody does want more information, just come back to me, and I'll be happy to give a bit more information about that. Good. So the other, I guess, trend that you've been seeing, Adam, in the market over there is the trend towards sustainability and green bonds and blue bonds and all kinds of investment in that space, right?
Well, I mean, the bond market has always been, was the first financial instrument to really gear itself towards sustainability. But we're now launching something called Nasdaq Green Equity. So we will be able to qualify companies as green shares. Essentially, the requirement there is that 50% of the revenue comes from green production or green revenue. And from our perspective, at the end of the day, there are two key things that stand out for the Nordic markets. The Nordic markets is particularly advanced on a global level when it comes to ESG. So if you do have an ESG story, not only will we help you tell it, but you should be building that equity part of you should be building that part of the equity story so that you can maximize the value of it, because here you have a very receptive audience from that perspective. So, I think ESG for us here in the Nordic markets is no longer a nice to have, it's a must. But again, for each sector, it's different. So they're looking at your peers in terms of how they're doing more than looking at, just a global standard, So, but it is a very active ESG community. For those that have, a bullseye in terms of clean tech or, clear ESG footprint, that will benefit them. For those that do not have it, they just need, a clear story in terms of how they're working on their ESG strategy and how it relates to the overall business model and governance.
Yeah, just circling back to the category that you had in the slide deck on the international companies. We've had 3 Irish companies go list on Stockholm, but they've all used Swedish. They've all been Swedish holding companies. So
exactly,
we don't turn up in the international category.
I know, and that slide is a bit misrepresentative because, and I keep on reminding myself to update it, but it's just wrong. So there is a technicality, and that technicality is mainly driven by the settlement infrastructure provided by Euroclear. that in order to be part of that Euroclear settlements, sometimes it's easier to put a Swedish topco on top. So that's a very well understood process. It's not costly. It's just in order to manage technical aspects of the equity market in a more efficient way. So really, it's just a technicality. It won't revolutionize or change your company. You just focus on the IPO. What they do is they put a Swedish topco on top, and then you fit into the system from a settlement point of view, a much more efficient way.
Yeah, I mean, I think from an Irish company point of view, it's made sense, and that's why they've all done it. But those international companies, Adam, can you talk a little bit about where they're from and what type of sectors they're in, and if you're seeing a particular trend of any sort?
Well, I think, as I showed you before, we're listing companies in the Nordics from all different sectors. Having said that, we are seeing more and more, interest from certain growth sectors, whether it's clean tech, whether it's technology overall, SaaS businesses. So I would say the majority of the companies looking at our markets are more technology driven and growth oriented rather than just stable businesses. But having said that, it doesn't mean that would not have a appetite, they would not find appetite amongst Nordic investors. The other aspect which I think they're looking for is this business that is being brought to the market scalable? Does it have a global demand? Is there a sort of a global ambition here? What is the key driver of listing? What is the equity story that the company is looking to build? Those are the key drivers. If those companies that have succeeded and done this well, and from a non-Nordic perspective, have all met those kind of requirements, and so far we've seen interest from clean tech. Gaming has been a very active sector for us. We've seen with the medtech company that I mentioned that raised 150 million euros. So you see a number of sectors or different participants within different sectors, but I think those key criteria which I mentioned before are the ones that advisors, investors are looking for.
Okay, very good. Well, we haven't had any more questions in, so I think on that basis, people have got the information that they're looking for. Really appreciate you, Adam, taking the time to come on the call with us this afternoon. Look forward to getting the deck, and if anybody wants more information, they can certainly ask me, and I'll be happy to see can we get it. And with that, I'll just thank everybody who's come on the call today, and look forward to seeing you again before long, Adam, whether it's in Dublin or Stockholm, but we're long overdue a beer.
Listen, it's great pleasure, and again, any question is a good question, and we'll make sure to get you answers. And at the end of the day, I do feel a strong appetite amongst investors and advisors to engage with non-Nordic companies. We continue to see a strong interest, and I'm happy to see the progress that we're making in this aspect. And so it's a very encouraging sign, and we encourage you to explore this alternative. So looking forward to working with you, both Alicia and the companies, in assessing case by case what would work best. Okay, Great. So all the best.